So the tower is the inevitable cataclysm, the inevitable breakthrough, the inevitable collapse and molting, the splitting of the crust that forms around the lower energetic structures on the tree. And what's happened when we look at the tree itself, we've connected all the paths in this lower triangle now, because we've connected the world, which runs from 9 to 10 from Yesod to Malkuth. We've connected the judgment, which runs from 8 to 10, or from Hod to Malkuth. And we've connected the sun, which goes from Hod to Yesod, and the moon, which goes from Netzach to Malkuth, and the star, which goes from Yesod to Netzach. And finally, we are activating the path between Netzach and Hod. So this is the first of the horizontal paths on the tree. As we go up, there will be 3 of them, and they represent essentially 3 thresholds, 3 areas where consciousness passes a definite boundary, a definite membrane, if you will, in the process of realizing the connection between Malkuth and Kether, which is essentially what this entire process is about. But this is a definitive stage, and if you think about it, the imagery of the tower is the imagery of the collapse of a shell, of a structure. So we have obvious mythology, the Tower of Babel. The story of the Tower of Babel, of course, goes back to this guy Nimrod, the hunter, who fired an arrow at the sun, and it landed in the place where he built the Tower of Babel, which is very interesting. It's a phallic gesture. It's a clearly phallic gesture, and the tower is an erection. It is the erection of a kind of a telescoping enclosure towards eternity, and in a way, we can see the tower as the vain and inevitable attempt to enclose the world in a law, in a code, in a system that is fully comprehensive. And so anytime a society entertains the idea that it can utterly encase our nature in a closed system, be that a theological system or a technocratic system, it's engaging the same basic hubris, building a tower to heaven. In other words, automatizing the function of eternity. And of course, there are those who think that eternity's function can be automatized. Deism supposes that the world is like a clock left by a clockmaker, but I think that's a fairly obvious example of basically people reading their tool set into the world they encounter. It's an extraordinary card, and it's one of the most iconic in the tarot. It's one of the cards that's usually missing from, or actually always missing from ancient tarots, because it had such an intense meaning. And I heard one of the reasons being things like the devil and the tower are missing from these early tarots, like the Viscontis. Here's an example of a reproduced Visconti Sforza tower. This is a modern interpretation. We don't know what the original looked like. Were they used for malefic magic? This was something I read. I don't know. But they have a powerful emotional charge. And there's a revolutionary current as well to the tower. There's the idea of collapsing the Tower of Babel, collapsing the institutional structure that encloses the human and creates a separation between the natural and the artificial. And it's interesting to me also that the polar opposite card in this case is the Hierophant, who's very much a kind of maintainer of conservative institutions. So there is, in the polarity between the always collapsing tower and the Hierophant's maintenance of tradition, there's a kind of a regenerative quality to the tower. It's always collapsing, but it regenerates as well. And if you think about many hyper conservative institutions are actually quite regenerative. The Catholic Church is quite regenerative. It does adapt, right? It changes doctrine. It sets up these. So its brittleness is part of its flexibility, paradoxically, which is what you can expect from a molting process too, right? So like a lobster breaks out of its shell and it's flexible, and then it forms a new shell. So I really strongly think this is a molting process, this threshold. And think about really what's occurred. You've had the sleeping dragon in the universe awakens, shines, undergoes a metamorphosis where the singular sun becomes an absolute polyphony. And we talked about asymmetries, and we talked about multiplicities. What happens with the activation of the star is, in a way, the discovery that breaks the very frame that was set up in order to make the discovery in the first place. What do I mean by that? I mean, sometimes we pursue a goal, and we see that goal as being a reasonable goal. And there's just a few things to take care of before we get to that goal. A, B, and C. And we take care of A, that's easy. We take care of B. We get to C, and we take care of C. But C is suddenly C1, C2, C3, C4, C5. Because there's complications. And then we approach C1, and now it's C1.1, C.1.2. You see what I'm saying? What happens is that simple task of getting from point A to B is actually complicated by the fact that there is an emergent problem that suddenly makes the initial goal untenable. And so in that respect, the idea of crowning the world in a closed system, which emerges out of the sun. This emerges out of the sun. The tower's foundations are built when the garden is walled. And those walls are extended upwards with the intention of enclosing the garden off totally to capture the sun. And, of course, the hubris of this could only be born out of a card like the sun, which has that kind of I can do anything kind of energy. But the star, thankfully, complicates it to the point where that tower cannot close. And this is actually a good thing. The fact that the tower will undergo a collapse is the key to a regeneration that's going to occur. And if the tower was to completely close, of course, we would have a system that can essentially lock off the lower portions of the tree. So it's the fact that this energy basically ejaculates, which is what it is. This is the tower exploding. It's struck by lightning from above and is devoured by a hellmouth from below, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But there's at least 2 points by which the tower is struck. And you can see in this, I mean, even though this is a reproduction, I love it because the sun and the stars are released from it. And you see the people who've been clinging to it, they're not going to fall particularly gracefully. They're not going to land like cats. Basically because they're so married to the structure that when it collapses, they'll suffer along with its collapse. But this does lead to some some ways of looking at the tower as a way of approaching crisis, so that we don't actually need to suffer incredibly when our towers collapse, and we can actually anticipate it. And there's other things we can do. There's, in a sense, if you go back to remember what we said about metaphors, Lakoff and Nunez's idea of not Lakoff and Nunez, Lakoff and Johnson, Lakoff and whoever Lakoff works with at any given point. George Lakoff's idea of metaphors. We use metaphors to structure higher thinking. We blend them together, and we take inferential content from the world, and we compress it and turn it into abstractions, and then we use that to reason. Metaphors is the foundation of reason. So if we recognize that this tower, this idea of catastrophe and collapse is a result of pressures coming from within and without, and the unsustainability of basically an entropic system like a tower, we can make novel moves. That's the interesting thing about metaphors, is you're not just saying this is like that. You're inviting people to reason along the lines of a scenario. So if I say, I don't know, love is like a North Atlantic fishing boat, then you can start to make moves. You can say, okay, if love is like a North Atlantic fishing boat, then, I'm going to go long lighting for swordfish, whatever that means, right? But what's weird is that we actually understand, once the model has been set, once the metaphor has been established, we actually understand moves that are non-canonical, precisely because they actually they do draw on the metaphor. So in this case, I would say these people falling from the tower could do other things. They could anticipate it. They could become the sun and the stars. So what is it that causes suffering in this case? Is it the collapse of the tower, or is it the way we've become accustomed to an enclosure, to feeling safe in an enclosure? So we can reason with these kinds of metaphoric tools, and we can come up with other ideas of how to manage the tower. We have in the Tarot of the Holy Light, we have some interesting imagery. It's very alchemical, of course, and there seems to be some sort of demonic characters from. It looks like they're from the Goetia or some such. One of them looks like I don't know, early Doctor Who, or Doctor Who from the 80s, right? It's like Tom Baker flying around. So this is an interesting example of, I guess, the shattering of an alchemical vessel, explosion. Right? These are contents under pressure that are exploding. And of course, the analogy I've mentioned, the analogy to ejaculation. Interestingly enough, if that's the case, is that the sort of the tension and then release follows the pattern of male orgasm, then one angle of approach to the tarot is the same angle of approach that the Taoists will take to energy cultivation. So the idea of orgasm without ejaculation as a method of retaining energy and retaining form, and particularly as a method of leading to physical immortality. So that might be a hint that there might be a way of rigging up the tower so that it doesn't actually collapse. So, for example, a lightning rod that powers an array of batteries. All these sorts of things could be construed as ways of harnessing energy from crisis. So there is that possibility as well. Although, and I've explored it, although the idea that we can allow the tower to collapse, the limits, the borders, the differentiations between inside and outside that are set up basically by the sun saying, look at me, look at me, look at me, I'm me, right? The ego. And this is the place where that foundation is revised. We've hit a point where we've realized, hold on a minute, the project is way, 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 way bigger than the initial circle we drew. So it has to collapse so we can draw a bigger circle. And so this is going to ultimately lead to many discoveries. Among them, the release of anything that's contained in the tower, because of course this tower does form to contain shadow energy, right? It forms in order to contain, like the ego forms in order to contain the id, which is basically wild animalistic energy that is untenable in a social situation. So when the tower collapses, of course, this is going to be released too, which is going to lead to the next few cards, in fact. But the focus here is on the breaking of the walls, the breaching of the barriers. And we have Benabel Winds, of course. Looking at this, she's got, you know, a bunch of different kinds of symbols coming in: the lightning, the trident, volcanoes, chains being broken, a bloody axe, a giant snake. I mean, she's going pretty full tilt. This is a very intense. I find that the Benabel's decks are quite dualistic, and they have a very, very strong kind of tension between, for lack of a better term, good and evil, light and shadow. There's a real sense of a war going on. Whereas in other decks, there's a more sort of the cycles of light and shadow are not pitted against one another in so Nietzschean a way, or so almost Zoroastrian kind of dualism. So Crowley's got the mouth coming from below, because Pe, which has a value of 80, means mouth. And so you can see, in a way, so you see these people who are like, geometrical abstractions. They're falling out of the tower, but the mouth is collapsing it from below, and the eye from above, with the lightning bolt. The eye, of course, is pointing towards the next card, which is Ayin, which is going to be the devil. So there is that element there. There's also the dove and the serpent. So the demiurgic serpent and the dove, which is obviously also sexual symbolism. This is, of course, attributed to Mars. I think I mentioned that. One thing I like to note, it's not so obvious here, but in cards such as the Rider-Waite, what's very obvious is these people would not fit in this tower unless they've been cast very, very, very far into the foreground. But the impression is that they're actually, this tower is about the right size of one of them, and what's happened is now that there's two of them, and maybe they're going to make 3 or 4 or 5, is this tower is now, it's too small. So that's the idea as well. Sometimes your category system, your thinking is too small. It has to break. And if you think of how much pressure the multiplication of sun into stars creates, suddenly the self is an other amongst myriad others. So how can the tower, which is initiated during the solar period, possibly contain the revelation of the star? It has to renovate itself. The crown, which is the in a way the premature attempt at unity, artificial unity, to achieve it through system, to achieve it through enclosure. It's this attempt to achieve it through enclosure that breaks, thankfully, because the magnitude of reality outstrips it. And so this is what we get. at this threshold, at this sort of breakthrough point, because of course it is a breakthrough point. Here's a lovely one, the Spiral Tarot. I don't have enough time to look at it, and again, I lament the fact that these cards are so small, but amazing paintings. Spiral Tarot brings in it's a kind of a fusion tarot of Celtic esque ideas and the Kabbalistic Golden Dawn style stuff. Again, here's the Alchemical Visions Tarot. Very big emphasis on the kind of the battleground that's going on here. And here's another lovely one from the ancient Italian deck. Such a striking card, right? The power to evoke emotions. I mean, what's amazing about the tarot, it's just a bunch of cardboard, but it freaks people out because the things that are depicted on it are deeply charged. And the tower is truly one of the most charged of all the images in the tarot. So, okay. Just want to make sure that I'm covering everything. Right, so basically we're looking at creative catastrophe, breakthroughs, messiness that leads to a bigger picture, and the thwarting of attempts to close everything into a locked down system, a premature unity. And so for that reason, of course, it represents revolutions, and it represents breakthroughs, and marks essentially the antechamber of initiation. I mean, this is a initiative process. We're moving up along the path of the serpent all the way towards the crown, and we have just opened the antechamber. There's a veil known as the Veil of Parocheth, which separates Netzach, Hod, and Tiphereth. Tiphereth is the seat of the adept, and we haven't actually touched Tiphereth yet. We haven't connected any paths to Tiphereth yet. So we are essentially establishing the conditions in which we can connect to Tiphereth. And the condition is that the crown of the tower has to come off. This gate has to be opened. So the last thing we can talk about here, I mean, we can talk endlessly about any one of these cards, but I want to touch on 16-foldness, because of course this is 16. And 16 is an interesting number. It's 4 times 4, and it can represent a closed system. One of the best examples, let me see if I can pull this up. I have to admit to really not being versed in this. I mean, everyone picks their specialties, so the 16 geomantic symbols, the Western geomantic symbols, is a major element of Western magic. I have not worked with it to the point where I know it off by heart. I've seen it assigned to of course, the 16 chord cards. So there are 16 chord cards in the deck. There are also 16 hidden paths. So if you were to connect the spheres where there is no, like the spheres where there is no path connecting on the tree, so like from here to here and here to here, and if you start to connect these, you'll find there's 16 of them. So there has been cases I've seen where people connect up the chord cards to that. Again, that's not something I've explored. These are the geomantic symbols, and they are combinations of open and closed, so 1 and 2 dots. There's 16 of them because they're in 4 ranks. This is a useful book. So that's one place you can go with the number 16. Why didn't I really work with that? Because I worked with the I Ching, and the I Ching is 64, which is 16 times 4. It is a geometric system. It's an Eastern geometric system, if you want to make an Eastern-Western division. So I found myself working with the I Ching fairly early on, and so I didn't feel drawn to the Western geomancy. But I do want to point out that the 16-fold Western geomancy actually, in its truest extension, is found in Africa, and there's a system called Ifa, which is found in Nigeria and in Benin and in Ghana and all over Africa, as far as I know. And it is a system similar to the I Ching. It's usually divination is cast with cowrie shells that maybe face up or face down in a strict combinatoria. Because that's the thing about these geomantic symbols, is there's a strict combinatoria, right? So you've got 4 ranks and you've got open and closed. You have to have 16. You can't have 15. You can't have 17. Same with the I Ching. There has to be 64 because there's 6 ranks of 2, right? It's 2 to the 6th. There has to be 64. It can't be 65 or 63. The Tai Swan Ching, which is a ternary geomantic system from China, has to be 81. The Ifa is 256 because it is 16 times 16. So what's interesting about it is an oral poem. It's not all even written down. There are 16 books with 16 chapters with an undisclosed number of lines in each chapter. And if you become a master of the Ifa, you have to know off by heart, you have to have memorized at least 10 lines for each of the 256 permutations. And it's a very structured and very strict system, and very powerful magical system. One of the great treasures of human heritage. Intangible cultural heritage is a UNESCO treasure, and it truly is. It's a remarkable thing. So that's where the 16-fold geomancy tends to go. So I bring this up because I want the awareness to be there, even though it's not a route I've specialized in. I could take a number of different approaches here. I think the one I'm going to take is the magic square, because I like magic squares, and the order 4 magic square. You've probably been with me long enough to have seen me do this in several different ways. I like word squares, and so this is the classic Taro. Taro, Ator, Rota, Orat, which, of course, loosely translated would mean something like Taro, Ator is a suffix suggesting action, Rota suggests a wheel, and Orat suggests speech or prayer. So the Taro, the action of the Taro is as a wheel of prayer. So that's one way to read it. You can see it's a 4-way palindrome. You could, of course, cubify this, right? So if I made another square that said Ator, Rota, Orat, Taro, or sorry, Ator, Taro, Orat, Rota, and another square that said Rota, Orat, Taro, Ator, and another square that said Orat, Rota, Ator, Taro, then you would have 4 such squares, and they would form a cube, and the symmetries would hold. So you can experiment with that. That's a useful thing to do. But I want to put this in terms of Hebrew, because how would you spell this in Hebrew? It's always handy to put it in Hebrew, because then you can do gematria. And there is some leeway with how you spell things. For example, we can say, so this is Tet, Aleph, Resh, Ayin for Taro. So Taro, Ator, Rota, Orat. This would be how I naturally spell it. And the gematria equivalent would be 200, which is the Resh, plus 9, which is the Tet, plus 1, which is the Aleph, so 210, plus 70, which is the Ayin. So basically 280. So that's interesting. Of course, you can divide it into 28 and therefore 7. So there's lots of divisibility. It's an interesting number. Let me propose another spelling, which is Tet Aleph Resh Vav, which could be Taru, Taro, but it pays some dividends to put it in this way, because Tet Aleph Resh Va is 9 plus 1, 10, plus 200, plus 6. So it is 216. And if you recall, 216 is 6 times 6 times 6, or 72 times 3, or the numbers of letters in the Shem HaMephorash. So this is, of course, a spelling that I'm going to use in magic, especially magic which relates to the 72-fold name, which is a comprehensive circle, if you will, of energies, a living circle. And so, a tarot square in this sense would have that larger energy. And of course, you could see this as being part of the tension, because of course the tarot is a foundation. It's always a tension between foundation, conservativeness, and breakthrough. So in my general sense, this does represent the conservative element of it, because of course magic squares, and in general the number 16. The number 16 is actually extremely square. So if the tower is 16 and 80, right? 80 might be a little bit more serpentine, but 16 is 4 times 4. 4 is very, very, very stable. So the emphasis here is actually on the stability of the tower when you look at the numbers. And yet, it's a stability that's constantly under fire from within, without, and it's a good thing. That's what keeps it vital. That's what, that it's again the same role that spirit plays in shaking up the hegemony of 4. 4 is brilliant. But it needs to be thrown into dynamism. 5 is required to shake it up. So Chesed forms, and then Geburah forms, and Geburah allows the element of time to essentially break the synchronic wholeness, the standstill that can occur with Chesed. So there's always this kind of mix of energies. So I think we've covered pretty much everything. If you're in a place like where I am, where there are skyscrapers, it's an interesting time to explore them, to explore towers. There's even old watchtowers near me from the colonial period. So sometimes when I'm walking this path, I like to go and explore the old watchtowers, because connecting to physical towers. This is a card really about urbanity, right? It's very urban card. Towers are an urban phenomenon. So so connecting to the urban, connecting to the towering structures. Oh yeah, one last thing that I wanted to say is compression. We've talked about compression before, and the idea of a system that starts out dispersed and then gets enclosed, and then enclosed again, and then enclosed again, and enclosed again, and gradually brought to a high level of tension, like forming a diamond out of a coal, through successive compressions. And if you look at a tower like, well, any tower sort of represent this telescoping series of compressions. Certainly a ziggurat does, and they say that the original Tower of Babel was like the ziggurat of Ur in Babylon or Iraq. And there is this sense of it's a step pyramid, right? So each step is more intense than the last. And same with the energy in a tower situation. As you go higher up, it ends up being more and more and more and more of an intense experience. And I think when we do the meditation, we'll explore that idea. But the tower as a kind of focal intensification through a series of, a series of pressurization experiences is definitely one way to look at the tower. In that respect, it's interesting to think about what is going into this set of compressions. And the experience of disaster or non-disaster has a lot to do with how the mixture is brought into. If you bring an elasticity with you into the tower, then in fact it lessens the disaster. I had a vision actually not that long ago of a different way of the collapse of the tower, which is a seed of an oak tree planted at its heart. And eventually the oak tree grows larger than the tower, and the tower collapses around it, but the oak tree remains firm. And the oak tree is a different type of tower. It's an organic tower. So, and it's not brittle or fragile in the same way, and it certainly can take lightning. So I encourage you to think around the metaphors, to come up with novel solutions, to think about what does this mean, what kind of scenarios can this be applied to, how can it be explored in different ways. Is the tower enormous, full of people, or is it tiny and just not, the coffin sized, like the RWS? When you're bringing material into the tower, is it material that will become very explosive when it's compressed, or is it material that will just gel, like sand into glass? There's all sorts of questions that you can ask, and all sorts of room for exploring this metaphor, as with all the metaphors, but exploring this metaphor in many different ways. But I encourage you to allow this card to be a portal this week into an opening of horizons, and an embiggening of the space of play beyond the size limitations you may have imposed upon it so far. Realize now that the great work is orders of magnitude larger than you thought. And I think that's if you can appreciate that at this stage, that this task is actually astonishingly enormous. And luckily we do it in little chunks and usually don't see the big picture, but know that now is a very good time to realize that the boundaries are much, much further away, and therefore we can grow into a much larger size, if you will. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll leave you with a thought that the title of this card is usually called The Blasted Tower Before the House of God. So what has to come down before we move into the true temple of Tarot? And I encourage you to allow the natural processes to do their work. So my name is Dr. Peter Duchemin. This is the Forest of Life Venus calendar, and this is week 16. Those of you who are in my course, keep going. Those of you who are not in my course and are watching this video, I encourage you to maybe contact me and perhaps join in the next round. So, Ga Yao, and I'll see you next time.